Fluke, Dale muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. His voice was gruff, defensive. She got lucky. Anyone can pull a stunt like that once. The younger biker, the one who had been quietly questioning things all evening, spoke up without thinking. Didn't look like luck to me. Dale turned sharply, his eyes locking onto the kid. You want to say that again? The younger guy shrank back, his face going pale. And nothing, man. Forget it. Dale didn't push it, but the damage was already done. The unspoken truth was hanging there, right in front of them. Natalie had proven herself without breaking a sweat, while Dale had been forced to scramble, pushing himself to the edge just to keep up. It wasn't a fluke. It was skill. And that truth stung worse than any insult. The group stood awkwardly for a few minutes longer, unsure of what to do. The bravado that had filled the parking lot earlier was gone, replaced by something closer to discomfort. Without another word, Dale stormed off toward the diner, shoving the door open hard enough to make the bell jingle violently. Inside, the waitress flinched at the sound, but forced a polite smile as he stomped toward the counter. Coffee, Dale grunted, throwing himself onto the nearest stool. The waitress hesitated as she poured. Everything, all right out there. Dale didn't answer. He just stared into his coffee cup like it might give him an explanation for what had just happened. For the first time in a long time, Dale felt small. The frustration churned in his gut like hot coals, but underneath it was something sharper, doubt. How had she beaten him? Who was she? Meanwhile, Natalie was still out by her car, leaning against the door as she rolled her helmet between her hands. She could feel the biker's eyes on her from across the lot, but she didn't let it bother her. She was used to this kind of attention. People always stared when you didn't fit their expectations, but Natalie had stopped caring about that a long time ago. One of the bikers, the younger kid who'd been so curious earlier, finally worked up the nerve to approach her. He walked slowly, hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, his steps crunching softly over the gravel. Natalie glanced up as he neared, her expression neutral but not unkind. Hey, he said quietly, stopping a few feet away. That was incredible. Where'd you learn to ride like that? Natalie studied him for a moment, as if trying to decide whether or not to answer. Then she shrugged lightly. A lot of places. I've been riding for years. Yeah, but he scratched the back of his head, hesitant. You are like military or something, right? The corner of Natalie's mouth twitched. Something like that. The kid's face lit up with a mix of awe and curiosity. Man, Dale's never lost to anyone on that trail. He's not gonna stop talking about this for a week. Let him talk, Natalie replied simply, her tone even. Doesn't change anything. The kid nodded, falling silent for a beat. Then he glanced back toward the diner, where Dale was still sulking inside. You know, he's not a bad guy. Just loud. Always feels like he's got to prove himself. Natalie looked at the kid, her expression softening slightly. And what about you? Do you feel like you have to prove yourself? The question caught him off guard. He blinked, shuffling his feet awkwardly. I dunno. I guess sometimes. Natalie nodded, her gaze thoughtful. You don't. Trust me. The kid looked down, processing her words, and for a second, it seemed like he wanted to say more. But before he could, the sound of an engine cut through the air. The bikers turned toward the road just in time to see a pair of headlights approaching. The sound wasn't as loud as a Harley, more like a pickup truck. Slowly, the vehicle pulled into the parking lot, its tires rolling to a stop on the gravel. The truck door creaked open, and a man stepped out. He wasn't tall, but there was a weight to his presence that made him seem larger. His frame was stocky, his face weathered and stern. He wore an old leather jacket that looked like it had seen its fair share of rough nights. The man's eyes swept over the parking lot, taking in the bikers, the diner, and finally Natalie. For the first time all night, the bikers fell completely silent, a ripple of unease passing through the group. Dale, still inside the diner, looked up through the window and froze mid-sip, his eyes narrowing when he saw the man. Without a word, he shoved his coffee cup away and pushed himself up from the counter, hurrying out into the lot. "Frank," Dale called out, his voice tight. The man, Frank, turned slowly toward him. "Dale," he replied, his tone level but cold. The bikers exchanged confused glances, whispering among themselves. "Who's that?" one of them muttered. "Frank Harden," another whispered back. "Used to ride with the big leagues. I thought he was out of the game." Back toward the diner, and another that dipped down sharply, overgrown and littered with rocks. Dale knew the second path was dangerous, especially at this speed. But his pride wouldn't let him slow down. If he could take it and Natalie couldn't, that would be the end of it. Without hesitation, Dale veered left, his bike lurching as it hit the rougher trail. The tires skidded, bouncing over rocks and debris, but Dale held on tight, his jaw clenched. Behind him, he heard Natalie's engine hesitate for just a moment as she reached the fork. Good, he thought. She'd slow down. She'd back off. But Natalie didn't back off. She followed. Dale's heart pounded in his chest as he realized what was happening. He could see her headlight in his peripheral vision, steady as ever. The trail was brutal now, every bump jarring his body. But she was right there, matching him turn for turn. Who asterisk is asterisk this woman? Dale barked to himself, his voice lost to the wind. He barely had time to react when the trail dipped even sharper than before. Dale's bike jolted, the front wheel catching on a loose rock. His body whipped forward, and for half a second, his heart stopped. He wrestled with the handlebars, trying to regain control. The bike wobbled violently, but by some stroke of luck, he pulled it back under him just before it could throw him off. He let out a shaky breath, his pulse pounding in his ears. But Natalie, she moved through the same dip like it was nothing. Her bike glided over the terrain with fluid precision, her body shifting just enough to balance the weight. It was clear now she wasn't just keeping up. She was better. Dale's face burned, his anger mixing with disbelief. How was this happening? How could someone like her, someone he'd underestimated, be making him look like an amateur? He pushed the bike harder, trying to squeeze every last bit of speed out of it, but the trail wasn't letting up. Another sharp curve appeared out of nowhere, and Dale had no choice but to slow down. Natalie didn't. She leaned into the curve effortlessly, her bike cutting through the turn like a hot knife through butter. As she passed him, Dale caught a glimpse of her face in the glow of her headlight. She wasn't smiling or gloating. She was focused, calm, her expression unchanged. It was like she didn't even see him as competition. The realization hit Dale hard, like a punch to the gut. He watched as Natalie's taillight disappeared ahead of him, swallowed by the dark. For the first time in his life, Dale felt small, like the loudest roar couldn't make up for the quiet power of someone who didn't need to prove a thing. When Natalie finally emerged from the trail and back into the diner's lot, the bikers were still gathered, their chatter dying instantly at the sight of her. She slowed the bike to a stop, dust swirling around her in the glow of the parking lights. She pulled off her helmet, her hair slightly tousled but her face calm, as if she'd just gone on a casual evening ride. A beat later, Dale came roaring back, his bike skidding to a stop not far from hers. He pulled off his helmet, his face flushed and streaked with sweat. His breathing was heavy, and his eyes darted toward Natalie, who was already climbing off her bike. For a long moment, no one said anything. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Finally, one of the younger bikers broke the silence, his voice barely a whisper. She beat him. The words hummed there, impossible to ignore. Dale shot the kid a glare, but he didn't argue. He couldn't. Everyone had seen it. Natalie glanced at Dale, her expression still calm, and said only one thing. "Thanks for the ride." Then she turned and walked toward her car, leaving behind a stunned crowd, and a man who just learned the hard way that some people's silence speaks louder than any roar. The silence in the diner's lot lingered like a heavy fog, making the air feel thick and unsteady. Natalie's calm departure had left the group in stunned disbelief, their eyes flickering between her retreating figure and Dale, who was still sitting on his bike, helmet dangling from one hand. His face was frozen in something that looked like anger, but felt more like humiliation. The loudest guy in the room had just been outdone, and by a woman he'd underestimated from the start. One of the bikers finally broke the tension with an awkward cough. "Man, what happened back there?" he asked, his voice low, almost uncertain. Dale shot him a glare sharp enough to silence him. He didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to explain how he'd been outpaced, outmaneuvered, and outmatched on a trail he knew like the back of his hand. That wasn't supposed to happen, not to him. He forced himself to climb off his bike, his movements stiff and deliberate, like he was trying to keep what little pride he had left into the darkness of the trail behind Dale. The hum of her engine grew fainter and fainter, until all that was left was the sound of crickets and the distant rumble of two bikes racing through the trees. One of the younger bikers finally broke the silence. "Who asterisk is asterisk she?" he asked, almost to himself. No one had an answer. All they could do was wait and wonder what would happen when the two riders came back. The dirt trail stretched out ahead like a ribbon of shadows and dust, winding through a patch of trees that seemed darker than the night itself. The hum of engines filled the air, sharp and relentless, as Dale took the lead, his bike bouncing over dips and rocks. He gripped the handlebars tight, his knuckles white under his gloves. This was his territory. The trail was rough, unpredictable, and he'd ridden it enough times to know every bump and twist. This woman, whoever she was, didn't stand a chance. Or so he told himself. The farther Dale sped into the trail, though the less sure he felt. Something gnawed at him, a sliver of doubt that grew louder with every glance he threw over his shoulder. Natalie wasn't far behind. Her headlight cut through the dark with a steady, unwavering glow. She wasn't losing ground. More than that, she wasn't riding like someone out of her depth. She moved with confidence, her bike flowing over the uneven terrain with smooth, practiced control. The farther Dale sped into the trail, though the less sure he felt. Something gnawed at him, a sliver of doubt that grew louder with every glance he threw over his shoulder. Natalie wasn't far behind. Her headlight cut through the dark with a steady, unwavering glow. She wasn't losing ground. More than that, she wasn't riding like someone out of her depth. She moved with confidence, her bike flowing over the uneven terrain with smooth, practiced control. Dale gritted his teeth and leaned forward, pushing his bike harder. The engine roared as he picked up speed, tearing through a sharp turn that sprayed dirt and leaves into the air. He thought maybe this would shake her, force her to slow down. But when he looked back again, there she was, closer now, her posture calm and relaxed, as though she were on a Sunday ride instead of a midnight challenge. "What the hell?" Dale muttered under his breath, his frustration mounting. Back at the diner parking lot, the bikers stood in a loose circle, their faces lit up by the pale glow of the diner's neon sign. A few of them leaned on their bikes, arms crossed, while others fidgeted, unable to hide their restlessness. The younger biker, the one who had spoken earlier, broke the silence again. "You think Dale's got this?" The guy next to him snorted and shook his head. "Of course he does. He's been riding that trail since we were kids. No way some random woman beats him. She's just putting on a show." "Yeah, but did you see her back there?" She knew what she was doing. The younger one shot back, his voice low. "That wasn't beginner stuff." Another biker chimed in, trying to sound casual but failing. "Maybe she's one of those adventure types. You know, military people or something." The group fell quiet again, the suggestion hanging heavy in the air. None of them had forgotten the way Natalie had carried herself, calm, unshaken, and frankly, a little intimidating. It wasn't just her confidence that unnerved them. It was the sense that she had nothing to prove. Whatever she'd done in her life, it was enough to make this silly challenge look like child's play. Inside the diner, the waitress nervously refilled coffee mugs for the handful of customers who had stayed behind, all of them murmuring about what was happening outside. One of the older men shook his head as he watched through the window. "She's gonna put that boy in his place. Mark my words." The waitress glanced at him, surprised. "You think so?" The man grinned, his wrinkled face lit up with amusement. "Oh, I know so. You don't mess with someone who's that calm under pressure. I've seen that look before." "What look?" "The kind that says she's seen worse," he replied simply, taking a sip of his coffee. Meanwhile, back on the trail, the race continued. Dale barreled down a straightaway, gripping the throttle as the bike shot forward. The wind whipped at his face, and he told himself that this was it. He'd finally pull far enough ahead to win. But then he heard it. A sound that sent a chill up his spine. It was Natalie's engine, smooth and unhurried, closing the gap. He glanced back again, and sure enough, her headlight was right there, glowing like some unshakable shadow. How was she keeping up? Dale's frustration turned to anger, and in a split second, he made a reckless. Natalie lifted her coffee cup and took a slow sip before setting it back down. Her expression didn't change. If anything, she looked mildly amused, as if the entire situation were playing out exactly as she expected. "I don't take challenges for free," she said lightly. Dale frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Natalie replied, "if I'm going to waste my time proving something to you, there should be something in it for me." "What's the wager?" The group of bikers shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other like they weren't sure what to make of this woman. The waitress, who had been lingering behind the counter, shot a nervous glance in Natalie's direction. The tension in the diner felt like it could snap at any second. Dale chuckled dryly, shaking his head. "You're serious, aren't you?" Natalie didn't respond. She just waited, her steady gaze locked on him, her confidence unshaken. Dale scratched the back of his neck as if trying to think of something to say. He wasn't used to being on the other side of the conversation like this. Finally, he shrugged. "Fine. You win, I'll buy you dinner." "My treat. You lose." "Well, you admit you're not as tough as you're pretending to be." The group behind him erupted with laughter, like Dale had just said the funniest thing in the world. A few of them slapped him on the back, grinning, but Natalie didn't laugh. Her face remained calm, the same faint smile still tugging at the corner of her lips. "Sure," she said simply. "Sounds fair." Dale blinked, surprised again by her answer. It was like she had no fear of losing. "All right then," he said, his voice louder as he turned to the group. "Let's take this outside." The bikers didn't need any more encouragement. They whooped and hollered, practically shoving each other out the door as they made their way back to the parking lot. The other customers in the diner stayed put, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. For a moment, the waitress lingered, her eyes darting between Natalie and the retreating bikers. "Ma'am," she said softly, "you don't have to do this." Natalie turned toward the waitress and smiled, her tone gentle. "It's fine. I've handled worse." The waitress didn't look convinced, but she nodded and hurried back toward the kitchen. Natalie slid out of the booth, grabbed her keys from the table, and walked toward the diner door. Her footsteps were slow, unhurried, like someone strolling through a park, rather than someone about to face a group of rowdy bikers. Outside, the gravel crunched under her boots as she stepped onto the lot. The bikers were already gathered around the dirt trail, a winding path that started behind the diner and disappeared into the trees. It wasn't long, but the twists, turns, and uneven ground made it a dangerous stretch to ride, especially at night. Dale had already mounted his bike, revving the engine to life with a loud, guttural roar that echoed across the lot. The others cheered him on, their voices carrying through the cooling night air. Natalie, calm as ever, walked toward her car and opened the trunk. Dale's grin faltered for a second as he watched her pull out a helmet, sleek, black, and clearly well-used. Without a word, she adjusted it over her head and walked back toward the group. "You brought your own gear," Dale said, half joking, half surprised. "Always prepared," Natalie replied, her voice muffled under the helmet. The group of bikers fell silent for a moment, exchanging uncertain looks. This wasn't how they thought things would play out. Dale, trying to hold on to the bravado he'd started with, kicked his bike into gear and pointed toward the trail. "You ready for this, lady?" Natalie climbed onto one of the diner's rental dirt bikes, an old but sturdy machine the owners kept for locals who wanted to explore the trails. She started the engine with practiced ease, the rumble of the bike steady and strong. For someone who didn't look like a biker, she certainly seemed to know her way around it. "Ready when you are," she said. Dale stared at her for a beat longer, then revved his engine again. "All right," he called out. "First one to the end of the trail and back wins. Don't fall behind, sweetheart." Natalie didn't respond. She didn't need to. She simply nodded once, her focus already on the trail ahead. Dale, clearly eager to show off, leaned into his bike and took off with a roar, kicking up dirt and gravel as he sped toward the dark trail entrance. The others cheered wildly, their voices mixing with the sound of the engine. Natalie waited a beat, her hands steady on the bike's handles. Then, without warning, she accelerated, the bike taking off with a smooth, powerful hum that silenced the cheering bikers. She didn't peel out like Dale had. There was no showboating or unnecessary noise. Her movement was controlled, precise, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "Coming right up," the waitress replied, jotting it down before hurrying back to the kitchen. The hum of the diner seemed to settle back into its rhythm, but outside, the bikers were already making their move. The leader pushed himself off his bike, his boots scraping the gravel as he started toward the diner door. A few of his crew followed, eager to see where this might go. The diner's bell jingled softly as they walked in. Every step they took seemed heavier than necessary, their boots thudding against the tiled floor. Natalie didn't look up. Years of experience had taught her to ignore distractions unless they became a problem. She sipped her water calmly, eyes still on the window, as the soft hum of conversations around her grew quieter. The leader, now close enough to speak, stopped just short of Natalie's booth. His presence loomed, his shadow stretching across the table. "Nice car you got out there," he said casually, the corner of his mouth twitching in what might have been a grin. Natalie's gaze finally shifted, her sharp blue eyes meeting his, without a hint of fear or annoyance. "Thanks," she replied simply, her tone polite but uninterested. The leader raised his eyebrows, clearly expecting a different reaction. "You're not from around here, are you?" He pressed, his voice carrying just enough edge to make the people nearby tense up. Natalie set her water down slowly, her fingers tapping the side of the glass as she looked him over once. Then, with a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, she replied, "No, I'm not." The group behind him snickered quietly, as if waiting for something big to happen. The leader leaned in just slightly, dropping his voice as he said, "You look like someone who thinks they can handle themselves. What do you say we test that out? A little challenge." Natalie didn't blink. She tilted her head, studying him for a beat longer before asking, "What kind of challenge?" The leader's grin widened, as if he'd just been handed the perfect punchline. "Let's just say, whoever can ride their bike through that old dirt trail behind the diner without wiping out wins." Easy, right? The crew behind him murmured their approval, some already chuckling at the thought of Natalie refusing, or worse, accepting and failing. It was a game, a trick meant to humiliate her. But Natalie Pierce didn't look humiliated. She looked calm, almost amused. And as she leaned back in her seat, her next words made the leader's grin falter. "You sure you're ready to lose to me?" she asked softly. For the first time, the leader paused, his confidence flickering just for a second. The rest of the diner seemed to hold its breath as they waited for what would happen next. "Let me know if you'd like me to expand on this further or develop the story more." The leader stared at Natalie for a long moment, his grin frozen in place, though it didn't seem quite as sure as before. The group behind him, who had been chuckling and whispering, quieted down, waiting for his response. A challenge wasn't supposed to turn the tables. It was supposed to make her back down, feel small, or maybe even flustered. But Natalie's calm, direct reply had shifted the energy in the room. It wasn't what they expected, and it caught the leader off guard. He cleared his throat and leaned back just slightly, as if trying to regain control of the moment. "Lose to you?" he repeated, his voice dropping just enough to sound serious. "Lady, I don't think you know who you're talking to." Natalie's lips curved into the faintest smile, the kind that said she wasn't buying the bravado he was selling. She didn't need to say anything more. The silence between them was enough. It wasn't tense, it was deliberate. A silence that came from someone who had nothing to prove. Dale, one of the younger bikers behind the leader, muttered, nudging him slightly, "Simon, man, let's just eat." The leader, apparently named Dale, didn't turn to acknowledge the younger guy. Instead, his eyes stayed fixed on Natalie, as if he were trying to size her up. She didn't look like much of a threat, not physically at least. She was lean and composed, but she didn't have the kind of rough edges you'd expect from someone who might be used to these kinds of games. To him, she looked too polished, too controlled. But that's what made Dale uneasy. There was something behind those calm blue eyes of hers, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Most people, when you pushed them, showed a crack, just a little hint of fear or nerves. He'd seen it 100 times before. But Natalie, she gave him nothing. And somehow that made her feel bigger than she looked. It irritated him. "You know what?" Dale finally said, his voice loud enough to carry across the diner. "I think we've got ourselves a game. You and me, lady. Out back on the dirt trail. Unless, of course, you're not up for it." The evening sun hung low on the horizon, streaking the sky with shades of fiery orange and deep purple. It was one of those perfect summer nights, the kind where the world seemed to slow down, and the air buzzed with possibilities. The drive-in diner, a vintage landmark off the main highway, was alive with the hum of car engines, the sizzle of frying burgers, and the soft notes of an old rock and roll tune playing from the jukebox. Families in station wagons, teenagers in beat-up cars, and motorcyclists looking for a break all stopped by. It was a slice of Americana where everyone, at least for a while, shared the same unspoken rules: order, relax, and mind your own business. That's how things usually went, until the arrival of a certain group of bikers. They roared into the parking lot like a storm on two wheels: leather jackets, greasy jeans, and boots that had seen better days. Their bikes, customized, loud, and unapologetically aggressive, announced their presence long before anyone even turned to look. Heads swiveled and conversations hushed as the group lined up their bikes, one by one, in the far corner of the lot. The leader of the pack, a tall guy with a weathered face and mirrored sunglasses, hopped off first. His confidence radiated like the roar of his Harley, blunt, sharp, and impossible to ignore. For the regulars, the sight of bikers wasn't unusual. Riders came and went, most of them polite and harmless enough despite their rough exteriors. But these guys weren't here to quietly eat their cheeseburgers and move along. You could tell by the way they spread themselves out, taking up more space than necessary, and the way they scanned the parking lot as if looking for something, or someone, to amuse themselves with. A few of the customers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one said a word. You didn't pick fights with people who looked like they lived for trouble. The diner staff, most of them used to rowdy customers now and then, kept busy. A young waitress in her early 20s was quick to turn up the music just a little louder, pretending not to notice. The cooks in the back exchanged knowing looks but kept their heads down. It was easier to let things blow over, but this night wasn't going to end quietly. Because out of nowhere, pulling into the diner with a sleek black sedan that practically gleamed under the neon lights, came someone who could change the mood of the entire place. Commander Natalie Pierce stepped out of her car with a kind of presence you couldn't ignore. She wasn't wearing her uniform, not tonight. Instead, she was in casual jeans and a plain fitted shirt that made her look every bit as sharp as the roles she played on duty. Natalie had served in the Navy for nearly a decade. She had seen combat, led teams, and faced situations that most people would only hear about in stories. She had an air of quiet authority about her, the kind of calm that didn't need loud words or swagger to prove its worth. But to most of the people at the diner, she was just another customer, a strong, confident woman looking for a late dinner after a long drive. Natalie didn't notice the bikers at first. Her eyes scanned the diner for a good spot, and she quickly settled into a booth by the window. It was a spot where she could stretch her legs and have a clear view of the lot, a force of habit more than anything. After signaling for a menu, she relaxed into the booth, letting out a slow breath. The day had been long, and the open road had only added to her exhaustion. A simple meal and maybe some coffee were all she needed to recharge. But the moment the bikers took notice of her, the night took on a new kind of tension. The leader of the group, still leaning against his bike with a toothpick sticking out of the corner of his mouth, tilted his head toward the diner window. Well, he muttered, loud enough for the others to hear. Looks like we got ourselves a tough one. The others turned to look, smirking and nodding in agreement. The leader didn't take his eyes off Natalie as she skimmed the menu inside. What do you think, boys? Think she could handle a real challenge? His words carried a note of mockery, but they weren't exactly a joke either. The others chuckled, already entertained by the idea. To them, Natalie looked out of place, too polished, too composed to fit in a rundown diner full of grease-stained tables and leather-clad bikers. She was the kind of person who, in their eyes, seemed like a prime target for teasing, maybe even testing. Inside, Natalie remained blissfully unaware of the group's attention for now. The waitress approached her booth with a friendly smile and a notepad in hand. "What can I get you, hon?" she asked. Natalie smiled politely, her voice steady and pleasant. "A cheeseburger, fries, and a coffee. Black."
Dale. caught between anger and confusion, was clearly struggling to understand what was happening. His pride was already bruised, and now this stranger, this man who seemed to command respect without asking for it, was treating him like a kid who didn't belong. Dale hated that. He hated feeling small. "I asked you a question, Frank," he said, his voice louder than it needed to be. "Why are you here?" Frank's eyes flicked back to Dale, his expression unreadable. "I'm here because I need to be," he replied flatly. The way he said it, like it was the most obvious thing in the world, only made Dale's frustration deepen. The younger biker, still lingering near Natalie's car, looked between her and Frank, his curiosity growing by the second. "Wait," he said cautiously, "how do you two know each other? You guys old friends or something?" Frank tilted his head, a ghost of a smile pulling at his lips. "Something like that," he said, but the tone suggested it wasn't something simple at all. Natalie remained silent, her gaze steady, as though she knew there was no point in explaining. Dale stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "This is my lot, Frank. My crew. You don't just walk in here and start acting like you own the place." Frank's chuckle was low and gravelly. "You think you're running something here, kid. You're loud, sure, but loud doesn't mean you're in charge." His voice was calm, almost conversational, but every word hit like a brick wall. The rest of the bikers shifted uncomfortably, exchanging uneasy glances. They had never seen Dale get talked down to before, not like this. Dale opened his mouth to fire back, but before he could, Frank turned his attention to Natalie again. "You've been busy," he said, his tone quieter now, almost thoughtful. Natalie finally pushed herself off the car, standing upright. "Life doesn't stop," she replied evenly. "You know that." Frank nodded slowly, as though her answer didn't surprise him. The two of them stood there, facing each other, and for the first time, the bikers realized just how much history might be sitting between them. There was an unspoken weight to their exchange, something deeper than words, and it made everyone watching hold their breath. "You still running things your way?" Frank asked, his voice low enough that it almost got lost in the wind. Natalie's gaze didn't waver. "Always." Frank let out a long breath, like he'd expected that answer, but didn't necessarily like it. "That's what I figured." Dale, who had been standing there like a coiled spring, finally exploded. "What is this?" He barked, his voice echoing off the diner walls. "You two sound like you're talking in code. Someone explain what's going on." Frank turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto Dale with a look that made the younger man stop mid-step. "You're too eager to know things that don't concern you," Frank said, his tone sharp but calm. "That's the problem with people like you. You're always in a hurry to be bigger than you are." Dale's face turned red. "People like me? What's that supposed to mean?" Frank didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to Natalie, his expression growing serious. "This," he said, gesturing around the lot, the bikes, the watching crowd. "This isn't where you belong, and you know it. You're wasting time out here." Natalie didn't react, though the words landed heavy. The bikers watched her closely, hoping for some kind of explanation, but none came. She stared back at Frank with that same steady calm, refusing to give anything away. "What's it matter to you where I am?" she finally said, her voice quiet but firm. Frank's jaw tightened just slightly. "Because there's more coming. You might think you're out, but you're not. People don't just disappear, not when they've been where you've been." The younger biker's eyes widened, his voice barely more than a whisper. "What's he talking about? Where've you been?" Natalie didn't answer. Her silence was louder than any explanation she could have given. Dale, still furious and unwilling to let his confusion go, stepped closer to Frank. "If you've got something to say, spit it out," he demanded. "You're throwing around all this cryptic nonsense like you got something over us. I don't care who you think you are, but—" Frank's glare stopped him cold. "You don't get it," Frank said, his voice a low rumble. "And you don't want to get it. You think you're untouchable because you've been king of the hill in this tiny corner of nowhere. But there are people out there who don't care how loud you talk or how fast you ride. People like her. He nodded toward Natalie. She doesn't have to prove anything because she's already proven it. The words kicked Dale harder than he wanted to admit. He looked at Natalie, his frustration cracking into something closer to bewilderment. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice quieter this time. The SUV door creaked open, and a man stepped out. He was tall and broad, dressed in dark clothes that made him look like a shadow against the dim light of the diner. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though he wanted everyone to see him coming. He didn't say a word as he stepped closer, his boots crunching against the gravel with each step. Natalie stayed perfectly still, her eyes never leaving him. Dale, who seemed to sense the shift in the air, finally spoke up, though his voice was less confident than before. "Hey, buddy, you lost or something?" The man didn't look at him. His attention was fixed entirely on Natalie, his face unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost polite, but there was a weight to it that made everyone's skin crawl. "You've been hard to track down," he said, directing the words at her. The bikers froze. Dale glanced between Natalie and the stranger, his confusion growing by the second. "What's he talking about? Who is this guy?" Natalie didn't answer him. Her eyes stayed locked on the stranger, her expression unflinching. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly, but her voice held an edge of steel. The man tilted his head slightly, a small smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "And yet, here I am." The bikers couldn't take their eyes off the scene playing out in front of them. Dale, who had been so sure of himself all night, now looked like a spectator in his own lot. "Someone explain to me what's going on," he barked, though no one paid him any attention. The man in the dark clothes took another step forward, his presence now looming like a shadow over the lot. "You can't keep running forever," he said, his voice low but carrying across the space. "You know how this works. It's only a matter of time." Natalie didn't move, didn't flinch, but there was something dangerous in the way she stood there, like a storm gathering just before the first crack of lightning. "I'm not running," she replied evenly. "You're the ones who keep showing up where you don't belong." The man's smile faded, replaced with something colder. "You think you can handle this on your own?" Before Natalie could respond, Dale finally snapped, stepping forward with his chest puffed out. "All right, I've had enough of this," he shouted. "Who the hell do you think you are, walking in here hand?" The man turned his head sharply, his gaze locking onto Dale with such intensity that the words died in his throat. "This doesn't concern you," the man said quietly, but there was no mistaking the threat in his tone. Dale froze, his confidence evaporating in an instant. The younger biker grabbed his sleeve, pulling him back. "Dale, don't mess with this guy," he whispered, his voice shaky. "Something's not right." The SUV's engine continued to idle in the background, a low hum that made the entire lot feel like it was vibrating with tension. Natalie, still calm and focused, finally spoke up. "You need to leave," she said firmly, her voice carrying just enough authority to cut through the silence. The man studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, almost as if he'd decided something, he nodded faintly. "All right," he said, stepping back toward the SUV. "But this isn't over, you know that." Natalie didn't respond, her gaze following him as he climbed back into the vehicle. The SUV's headlights swept across the lot one last time before it reversed out onto the road, tires crunching slowly until it disappeared into the darkness. The silence that followed was suffocating. The bikers stood frozen, their faces a mixture of confusion and unease. Dale looked at Natalie like he was seeing her for the first time. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost careful. Natalie let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing just slightly. "Nothing you need to worry about," she said softly, but her eyes were still trained on the road where the SUV had vanished. The younger biker looked at her, his voice filled with concern. "They're not gonna stop, are they?" Natalie didn't answer. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes said it all. The air in the diner lot grew colder, though no one moved or spoke. It was as if the earth itself had paused to see what would happen next. Frank stood there, his presence heavy enough to pull everything around him into silence, like some unseen force had shifted the balance of the night. Natalie, still leaning against her car, watched him closely. Her calm demeanor hadn't wavered, but her eyes were sharp, calculating, as though she were piecing together an invisible puzzle.